Hey guys, it's Max. I did some back tests last night and I wanted to compare YieldMax and Kurv. They're similar funds. They have single stock high yield funds. They have some similar underlines. They both have a Tesla fund. They both have an Apple fund, Microsoft. Anyway, I thought it would be interesting to compare Kurv with YieldMax. And it made me think, I've been wanting to do this video for a while. There's something that people miss about YieldMax and really Kurv for that matter, but they miss this one thing about high yield ETF investing. And it's a key thing. Stick around till the end. I'll tell you what that is. Okay, so let's go back a year and compare Kurv to YieldMax. So we're going to have three guys. Let's say Mark has $1 million. He's hoping to live off $5,000 a month. He's been watching influencers that warn of the dangers of YieldMax. But what about the erosion? Aren't these all going to zero? Look at MRNY. All right, so Mark made a portfolio of SPY and JEP-I to stay away from all the erosion. 80% SPY, 20% JEP-I. John is retiring with $1 million saved up. He's also been listening to influencers warning of the dangers of the high yielders. So he's using the Kurv ETFs. It's common knowledge that Kurv protects the NAV better than YieldMax, right? All right, and then we have Max. He loves high yield. Max is a portfolio of YieldMax, of course. All right, so that was the scenario. We're going to see which philosophy, which companies' investments come out ahead. I guess not really philosophy, which allocation comes out ahead. Okay, so but we're gonna consider Max's best practices when we set up this scenario. So the best practices is first, don't use high yield unless you need an income. In all three of these cases, these guys were needing an income and we're going to withdraw $5,000 a month. Okay. If these guys were still working and didn't need the $5,000 a month, then these allocations wouldn't be for them. So that's number one. Now these high yield ETFs can be used for diversification and for tactical purposes. There's other things, but mainly it's for income. If you don't need an income, there's plenty of better investments out there. Okay. In my opinion. These are tools for people that have equity, stock, and they're trying to unlock some of the portion of that equity and turn it into income. There is no free lunch, no free money. As such, these tools, just like all tools, just like everything, has cost. The cost is this strategy, which is covered call selling, partially caps the upside. That's one reason why I only recommend 20% and really less if possible. Only use as many high yielders as you need to generate the income you retire in requirement. Remember, these guys needed $5,000 a month, so we're going to keep that in the scenario. So these tools are not good for creating wealth, despite the fact YieldMax and Kurv did pretty sweet in these back tests, but they aren't supposed to be for creating wealth. All right, so YieldMax is breaking the matrix. Let's go look at I did the test 3 different ways. All right. So here, first of all, let's start with the portfolio. So 80-20, we have SPY and then 20% split up into 5 YieldMax funds. And it's the same 5 ones, same underlines that Kurv is split up into: Apple, Microsoft, Goop, Amazon, or Goop, Google, Netflix, Amazon, Google, Microsoft, and Apple. Same stocks: Netflix, Amazon, Google, Microsoft, and Apple. Okay. 80-20 and then 80-20. Okay. And then we have, I forget his name, but we have the JP Morgan guy. All right. So now let's look at the return on all of these. Well, the JP Morgan, I'm sorry, I was going to show this. He's just 80-20, 20% in JP Morgan. Now the other people were diversified in their 20%, but JEPI has 100 stocks, about 100 stocks in it. So this one fund is diversified enough. So 80-20. Now let's just look at the return. This doesn't factor in the taking 5,000 out. This is just how much these guys were making, let's say the year before they retired. If they weren't retired yet and just buying and holding, YieldMax would have made 35% and the Kurv strategy would have made 35% also. Now the JP Morgan strategy would have just made 31%, but that's crazy. Both Kurv and YieldMax made the same total return. That's good. Now let's go see what else we can tell from this back test. Well, here's something else we can tell. We can see that Kurv or YieldMax almost beat the SPY, beat the benchmark, came within $6,000 or $7,000, and so did Kurv. We can see here that the YieldMax strategy had the best risk-adjusted reward by looking at the Sharpe and Sortino ratio. There's the portfolio growth. They're all very similar. Here's the annual returns of all the portfolios. Once again, they're very similar. In 2024, look at that. YieldMax and Kurv both beat the SPY for the 2024 calendar year. That's incredible. Here's where the problem, or not problem, here's where the opportunity lies, maybe. Okay, so these guys, all three people, they're trying to withdraw $5,000 a month. So which comes to $60,000 a year. Well, the YieldMax portfolio already, as it sits with the 80-20 allocation, generates more than $100K in income. This guy doesn't even need this much income. He's only, he only needs 60,000. He's getting twice that. All right. So what does Max's rule say? No more than you need. So what are we going to do? We're going to cut this allocation. We're going to cut it down to where we only make 60, and then we're going to put the rest in SPY. Because we want to keep our portfolio growing. We want to have as much, and the idea is to keep as much in SPY as you can. Use just as little of these as you need. Not that these aren't great funds, but a little bit of these goes a long way. I mean, think about that. An 80-20 SPY and YieldMax gets you more than 100,000 a year. That's insane. Okay, so now what I wanted to do in the next test is equalize. I'm gonna take allocation away from the YieldMax guy to make it where he earns 60, and I'm gonna add some allocation to the Kurv investor. They're only making 50 right now. I'm gonna add some risk to their allocations, and I'm gonna add a lot of risk to the JP Morgan one and make all of these allocations or all of these incomes equal, so we can have an apples to apples comparison. So we'll do that on the next slide. All right, on the next slide, this factors in taking 5,000 out. The next slide, yeah, this takes 5,000 out every month. All right, and then it sees how the portfolio would have done. Now, the first thing to look is this YieldMax portfolio is now a 90-10. So they got to cut their allocation back of YieldMax because they didn't even need that much YieldMax. They put the rest in SPY. That's great, right? Okay, well, the Kurv guys needed a little bit more risk, so they had to take a little bit out of SPY and adjust their allocation upwards. They're now 75-25, but that's not too bad. They still have some in SPY. And then the JP Morgan dude, he has 60% in the high yield fund, JEPI, and only 40% in SPY. So now let's see how these people did. The YieldMax fund made 28.7%. Almost beat the benchmark. The Kurv fund made 28.4%, just made a little less. And the JP Morgan fund made 17.9%, made quite a bit less. The difference is, look at this. The difference is right here. All three portfolios are normalized for income. They all make about what they need to pay out. So these portfolios should be self-supporting and should, in theory, not have to sell stock in retirement. The portfolio's generating enough income from their high yield portion to offset, so you don't have to sell SPY shares. When you normalize for that, what it does is it lets you put a little bit more money in SPY when you use YieldMax and the higher yielding funds. So if you have a little bit more money in SPY in a good year, you're going to do a little bit better than somebody in Kurv, because the Kurv guy, apples to apples comparison on the same income, is going to have a little bit less money to be able to put in growth. That's the takeaway from this, is that the high yielders, sure, YieldMax has a lot of NAV depletion. It has about twice as much as Kurv. NAV depletion is just part of the story. You have to look at the total return in a portfolio. Yeah, if you have so much NAV depletion, you're killing your portfolio and your return's negative. That's a problem. That's why I'm trying to show ways to retire on these in a somewhat of a smart way, or intentional way. Anyway, when I did this test, I expected the Kurv would win. I didn't expect YieldMax would do this well, but I'm going to call it a tie. I mean, I'm not going to call it a tie. Even YieldMax won by 3/100ths or 0.3 of a point. And I think they deserved it because, I mean, all I care about is having as much growth stocks as possible. If it was possible to support my lifestyle on a 95.5 portion, I would do that. If it was 99.1, I would do that. Use as little of these as possible because SPY is where your wealth is built from. These are trying to create income. Income and wealth are two different things. And in fact, lots of times income cannibalizes your wealth, partially cannibalizes your wealth. A big income comes from wealth, not the other way around, in my opinion. YieldMax is kind of breaking the matrix. YieldMax has more income even after you figure in the NAV depletion. YieldMax and Kurv, for that matter, spanked JP Morgan. Think about this. YieldMax and Kurv almost beat the SPY in total return over the course of a year. That's not supposed to happen. They almost beat the SPY while paying out $5,000 a month and still appreciating. Now, it's been a great year in the market. Next year may not be like this year. These things are totally 100% dependent on how the underlying does. Or they're 90% dependent on how the underlying does, but they're 10% dependent on the volatility going up and down. And they like high volatility. They make a little bit more in high volatility, but the biggest determining factor, how much these funds will make and which funds are going to be the best ones for next year, is which underline is going to be the best underline for next year. So here's a rule of thumb with any high yield ETF, without knowing anything else, the ETF that pays less, if you have one ETF that pays 10% and one ETF that pays 30%, the one that pays less is frequently the one that has more total return. Not so with YieldMax and Kurv, though. That's what I mean. They're breaking the matrix in comparison to JP Morgan. Now we're going to try YieldMax versus Roundhill and Kurv versus Roundhill. We'll run that test. We'll run that test tomorrow. Do you think that'll be interesting? Now, Roundhill, we don't have a year. I think they started in March, but it's getting close. We'll try YieldMax and Kurv versus Roundhill. But I think for this round, we can declare YieldMax the winner, but we can also declare that Kurv did really well, and there does not appear to be anything wrong with Kurv. Let's go back here. I'm going to show a use case for Kurv. If you weren't in retirement yet, and you just needed a little income, maybe if you had an emergency come up, like you need a new transmission in the car and you have to come up with 5 or 10 grand real quick. If a person that had the Kurv fund that's making about $50,000 of income a year might be all right with that. Kurv I'm going to say right now, probably be better for somebody that's currently still working because it does appear to have slightly better total return. Also, if you don't need the income, you don't take the extra risk of YieldMax, right? So Kurv while you're still working, and then YieldMax when you aren't working, right? But they're both good. They're both good. I mean, and JP Morgan's good also. I just think it's interesting what happens because this is the main difference between the funds. 100,000 to 50,000 to 30,000. That's a gigantic difference. We have to deal with this. That's the thing that everyone misses about YieldMax and about Defiance and about Roundhill, about the ones that pay super high dividends like 30, 40, 50, 60, 70%. Those ones also have super high NAV depletion. That when I always talk about erosion's a red herring, what I mean is because it's not really a thing. What these funds are actually doing, erosion is a thing that other ETFs do. It's not these funds. These funds have NAV depletion. I know it's just a word, but it makes a difference. And depletion implies something that is regenerated, replaced. Erosion implies something that's not coming back. So that's why, portfolio managers get mad when you say their funds eroding. It'd be like go tell a portfolio manager that his wife has a good personality, which is which is a metaphor for somebody that's not attractive, I'm saying it's not a compliment to say somebody's high yield fund erodes, and it's not factual. They do have NAV depletion. So here's the key thing to understand. The depletion is the dividend. The call is coming from inside the house. An ETF that pays 100% dividend is going to have 100% NAV depletion. It's the same thing. It's the same thing. The erosion's a misnomer, but the NAV depletion is not a thing. And it's easy to know. It's the amount of the dividend because it literally depletes. But then what happens? Then it builds back up as the month goes on. I mean, ideally, sometimes it builds up back up within a couple of days. Sometimes it doesn't, it takes a couple of months. But why is that? Well, because it depends on the underlying. These stocks are 100% the underlying. You're just playing the underlying. It's just a different way to play the underlying. It's a tool to turn equity into income. That's all it is. All right, guys. Does that make sense? Hope you guys like this. Have a good day. Join my Discord.